Good morning, world. What's up? What's up? What's up? Yes. So I'm just catching up with some friends and folks um, because I'll tell you in just a second. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Can you stay right there? There we go. All right. So, what's up, world? Great to be back with everybody. I was on LinkedIn over the weekend, but other than that, my weekends are social media free. I just ain't got it. It's only so much of me, and I have to focus on my own happiness and survival and perseverance and stuff. So for me, social media free weekends, take a break. I still had work stuff to do, so I was still on LinkedIn, and I didn't just you have to know yourself and you have to figure out how this is going to work best for you. And I've already, hey girl, ooh, bring your baby girl. I'm getting ready to read a story. But yeah, I have to do what's best for me. And as I'm going through this journey and making sure that I come out on the other side better, what up? I decided that social media is too much. Let me tell you what really pushed me over the edge before I, shared this children's story was Little Boosie. Oh my God. Did y'all know what I'm talking about? And of course, people want to call my phone now. But after I saw what Little Boosie had going on, I was like, yo, social media is not going to bring down my property value. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to be watching and taking in all this ratchet and ridiculous information, so Instagram, Twitter, you're not going to find me there on the weekends. I'm going to be doing something productive, something better. I'll be with y'all all week. You know what I'm saying? See what's going on. But just like I said, I'm only watching the news at night. I have been watching some of these press conferences during the day and stuff just to see what they're saying. But yeah, and I think, we should all think about how much information that we're taking in from social media and just police it. Don't let all that stuff get in and on you. Your mind is valuable, your time, your space. So make sure that you're engaging with things that are making you better. Cause I was like, really? Like Boosie is having an incredible 2020, but that's another story. So I'm here to bring you another story. I'm going to be reading stories every day, Monday through Friday at 11:15. And so this is a story I've read in my classroom a lot. These books, the Negro Heritage Library, they're from the 1960s. And when I was living in Brooklyn, like 4 years ago, I found these on the street and someone's gonna throw them away. And my heart was like, no, how could this happen? So I've been hanging on to these books, using them in my classes, using them in lessons, but it's a very, very old book. Every time I touch it, something comes off because they're falling apart. But the stories that are in these books, I've never really heard anywhere else. So I feel like I'm kind of, making sure that certain information is kept in the public realm, especially the story of Ellen Craft. And Ellen Craft is a slave who escaped from slavery as a slave owner with her husband who passed as her slave. So this is the story I'm reading for you today. And this is the image I want you to be mindful of as I read the story. Some of the stories I've read before were, children's books. So I was like showing the images and stuff. But this is, as you can see, like straight prose. But that's the principal image that you should have in your mind as I'm reading you the story of Ellen Craft. All right. So it's 11:20. Let's go ahead and jump straight into this. Again, Ellen Craft, who escaped from slavery as a slave owner with her husband who passes her slave. As a carriage drew up in front of the door of the best hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, the landlord came hurrying out to greet his new guest. The Negro servant waited by the carriage door, still seated inside a rather youthful-looking planter wearing a well-tailored suit and fashionable hat. The landlord's eyes took in the thin face, particularly concealed by green glasses in a thick poultice, and the right arm held in a sling. Assuming the guest was an invalid, he tenderly took him by one arm, ordering the servant to take the other. The gentleman introduced himself as William Johnson and apologized for being unable to sign the register because of the injury to his arm, which he explained he had suffered on the journey. The landlord assured him that that was not of consequences and signed for the new guest, thinking he was rendering a service to a young white planter of distinction. A few minutes later, Mr. Johnson, assisted up the stairs by the attendant and his own servant, was shown to a comfortable bedroom. As the door closed on the attendant, Ellen Craft, alias Mr. Johnson, swiftly drew her arm out of the sling, removed the poultice and the rest of her disguise, and looked at her husband. Ellen and William Craft had completed the first leg of their journey, but it was far too soon to know if they had successfully made their escape from slavery. Meanwhile, a number of things still had to be done to continue the deception. William hurried down the stairs to tell the landlord that his master wanted 2 poultices as quick as possible. Ellen Craft was born in Georgia. Her first master was her father, her mother his slave. She was an attractive girl, so nearly white, her husband wrote later, that she had frequently been mistaken for a child of the family. This proved so annoying to the lady of the house that when Ellen was 11 years old, she gave her away to her daughter as a wedding present. This cruel separation from her mother and close friends was such a traumatic experience for the girl that the thought of her ever becoming a mother of a child in slavery filled her with horror. The horror stayed with her over the years. It cast a heavy shadow over their happiness when she and William Craft fell in love with each other. What could the future hold for them in bondage? Desperately, they sought a means of escape. Together and apart, they thought of nothing else. Plan after plan was explored, only to be discarded because of the insurmountable difficulties each presented. Ellen and William knew it was unlawful for any public conveyance to take them without their master's consent. And they were also perfectly aware of the fact that if they were to leave without consent, professional slave hunters would soon have their bloodhounds baying their tracks. Capture would mean separation for life. They might be assigned to the very meanest and most difficult drudgery, or be tortured to death as examples to strike terror in the hearts of others might be contemplating flight. Reluctantly, the young couple reached the unhappy conclusion that it was almost impossible to escape from slavery in Georgia and travel 1,000 miles across the slave state. With the consent of their owners, they were married and settled down into slavery. Then, very suddenly, as the Christmas of December 1848 approached, William conceived a daring plan. Since slaveholders had the privilege of taking their slaves to any part of the country, and since Ellen was white enough to pass, it occurred to William Craft that if she were to disguise herself as a gentleman, she could assume the role of master, and they could escape as master and slave. At first, Ellen shrank from the idea. How could it be possible for her to assume such a disguise and travel a distance of 1,000 miles across a slave state? Then she thought of the alternative, to remain forever in a state that regarded her as mere chattel to be bought and sold without any control over her own life, without anything to say about her children. There was really no alternative after all. William went to different parts of the town at odd times, purchasing the articles of clothing needed for Ellen's disguise, piece by piece, so as not to arouse suspicion and bring them to the house where she lived. Since she was a lady's maid and a favored slave in the family, she was allowed a little room of her own and had among a few possessions of furniture and a chest of drawers. She carefully locked up the articles William brought her in these drawers, and they were never discovered. She worked at night on the trousers, as she found it necessary to make them herself. When all their preparations were made, the couple set a date for their flight. Some of the more indulgent slave owners occasionally gave their favorite slaves a short holiday during the Christmas season, and the Crafts sought permission to spend time on a farm 12 miles from Macon. After no small amount of perseverance, Ellen obtained a pass from her mistress, allowing her to be taken away for a few days. The cabinet maker for whom William worked gave him a similar paper because his services were needed. Requested him to be returned as soon as the time granted was up. Ellen, knowing she would be spending a good deal of the time during their journey in the company of gentlemen, felt it would be wise if she wore something over her eyes. And on the eve of their departure, William brought her a pair of green spectacles. The two sat up all night discussing their plans and making preparations. Early the next morning, William cut off his wife's hair, square in the back of the head, and she swiftly donned her disguise. When she was dressed, her husband observed that she made a most respectable-looking gentleman. Since she could neither read nor write, Ellen decided to feign invalidism and make herself thoroughly dependent on her faithful servant, who had a little schooling. A heavy poultice tied around her face would make it appear understandable if she were to speak softly. And with a sling and bandage on her right arm, she could not be expected to write. No detail seemed to have been overlooked. Here you go, Renegade acting crazy. What's up? Oh, let me keep going. All right. Let me make sure I show y'all this picture. This is the important picture. If you weren't here from the beginning, this is the important picture. Some of the other stories I've been reading were like picture books, but that's the only important picture to this story. All right. All right, y'all ready? Here we go. It was time to start. They blew out the light and knelt in prayer. They waited for a few moments in breathless silence, fearful lest someone might have been outside the cottage listening to their plans, watching their actions. Then, not daring to delay any longer, William took his wife by the hand and gently he led her to the door, softly raised the latch and peered outside. Not a leaf stirred on the trees surrounding the house. The whole world seemed to have stopped. The stillness frightened Ellen, and she drew back trembling. When William asked her what was wrong, she didn't answer, but flung herself against him and burst into tears. They both saw the difficulties that faced them and knew what their sad fate would be if they were caught and forced back into slavery. But they had gone over this all so many times. William, holding Ellen close, tried to still her fears, and she finally regained her self-possession. She quickly dried her tears, adjusted her glasses, and smiled at her husband. "Come on, William," she said. "It's getting late." They stepped outside, walking carefully across the yard and into the street where they had to part and starting off in different directions for the railroad station. William took the shortest possible road for fear that he would be recognized by someone who waited at the station in the section reserved for Black people. Ellen traveled the longer way around and arrived at the station the same time as majority of the white passengers. She obtained a ticket for herself and one for her supposed slave to Savannah, the nearest seaport about 200 miles away. Then Ellen, as the master, had the luggage stowed away and boarded one of the best carriages. From now on, she had to remember that she was William Johnson, slave owner. Just before the train moved off, William noticed the cabinet maker for whom he worked, talking to the ticket seller. A moment later, the man started down the platform, peering into each of the carriages as he went by, appearing to be looking for someone amongst the passengers. Convinced that they were being pursued, William shrank back into a corner, staring at the door, expecting it to open. The cabinet maker looked into Mr. Johnson's carriage, but did not recognize him in his new attire. A moment later, the bell rang and the train moved off. As soon as the train left the platform, Ellen dared to look around the carriage at her traveling companions and was terror-stricken to find Mr. Gray, an old friend of her master who had dined with the family a day before and knew her from childhood. What was he doing there? Had he come to get her? She waited, but he looked at her without recognition, afraid to be drawn into conversation lest her voice be recognized. She feigned deafness when Mr. Gray started to talk, and for the rest of the journey, she sat looking out the window. The train arrived very early in the evening at Savannah, and the Crafts got into an omnibus, which took the passengers to the hotel for tea. William brought a tray for his master to the omnibus, for which later conveyed them to the steamer bound for Charleston, South Carolina. Soon after going on board, Ellen turned in. The captain and some of the passengers seemed to think this strange and said as much to William. He hastened to explain that his master was suffering from rheumatism and got out the flannels which they had packed for such an emergency, warming them by the stove in the gentleman's saloon before bringing them to Ellen's berth. A large crowd had gathered in the Charleston quay to await the arrival of the steamer. As soon as it drew alongside the dock and the passengers began disembarking, William and Ellen panicked. It soon struck them that someone might have discovered that they were not at Dr. Collins' farm and that they had gotten out, that the Crafts, the word had gotten out that the Crafts had fled. If this were so, it were too late to do anything about it now, and they couldn't very well remain on the boat. William took Ellen by the arm, and with a little difficulty, Mr. Johnson hobbled ashore and drove to the best hotel, which John C. Calhoun and the other great Southern fire-eating statesmen had made their headquarters while in Charleston. After many difficulties and several tense moments, the fugitives finally reached Philadelphia and immediately took the cab to the boarding house which had been recommended to them. When they arrived there, Ellen, who had borne up in a manner that surprised them both, burst into tears. Now that their perilous journey was over, she felt herself on the verge of collapse. Inside their room in a house owned by friendly free Negroes, the two knelt in prayer once again, thanking God for redeeming them from bondage. Ellen threw off her disguise in relief and put on her own apparel. A little later, the landlord brought in several of the leading abolitionists of the city who gave the couple a hearty and friendly welcome. Since it was December and they had just left a warm climate, they were advised not to go to Canada as they had intended, but to settle in Boston instead. Again, on the advice of friends, they were married over again in Boston by Reverend Theodore Parker, an abolitionist minister. The Crafts remained in Boston for 2 years. William found employment as a cabinet maker and Ellen as a seamstress. In 1850, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Laws, they once again found themselves in a precarious situation. Their old masters sent agents after them. Warrants were issued for their arrest and placed in the hands of the United States Marshal to serve. Plans were hurriedly made for the Crafts to leave the country. The Reverend Samuel May, another prominent white abolitionist minister, wrote a letter to Dr. Estlin of Bristol, which was to be delivered to him by the Crafts, explaining their situation. I trust that in God's good providence, this letter will be handed to you in safety by our good friends William and Ellen Craft. They have lived among us for about 2 years and have proved themselves to be worthy in all respects of our confidences and regards. Within a fortnight, the two fellows from Macon, Georgia, have been in Boston with the purpose of arresting our friends William and Ellen. Under these circumstances, it is almost unanimous opinion of their best friends that they should quit America as speedily as possible and seek asylum in England. That's what the letter read. Reverend May accompanied the couple as far as Portland, Maine. The Crafts were ever grateful to the Vigilance Committee of Boston and also to their many friends for their very kind and noble manner in which they assisted us to persevere our liberties and escape from Boston. From Halifax, Nova Scotia, they took a Cunard liner to Liverpool, where they were free at last from every slavish fear. Through William Brown's influence, many English people became interested in the crafts and made it possible for them to go to school for 2 years. In his Sketches of Places and People Abroad, William Brown describes an interview between Ellen Craft and Lady Byron, which is said to have taken place in a small dwelling on the estate of Earl of Lovelace in the county of Surrey. After ascending a flight of stairs and passing through a narrow passage, Lady Byron, so the story goes, found herself in a small but neat and plainly furnished room. On the table lay copies of Garrison's famous abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. Near the window sat a young woman busily sewing, a spelling book on her lap. She was so intent on her work and study that she did not at first hear the noble woman's approach. But after a moment or two later, the lady observed. The student hastily arose and apologized for her apparent inattention. The stranger was soon seated in a conversation with the young woman. The lady had often heard the word slave and knew something of its implication, but had never before seen one of her own sex who had actually been born and brought up in the state of chattel slavery. And the one whose company she was in now was so white. She had so much the appearance of a well-bred and educated lady that she could scarcely realize that she was in the presence of an African-American slave. William Craft made several trips to West Africa in service of a London business house in an attempt to increase business with that part of the continent and became financially successful. The Crafts, however, did not let their newly improved circumstances make them forget their people in the United States. When the colored orphanage, which had been destroyed during the draft riots of New York in 1863, reopened in October, contributions were received from many far-off places. From London, Ellen Craft sent bundles of clothing that she had made herself. After the Civil War, the Crafts returned to the United States with their 5 children and settled on a plantation bought by William near Savannah, Georgia. William became active in local Negro affairs, established an industrial school where ambitious colored youth could obtain an education. Ellen gave her children all the love and devotion which she had been denied from her mother. Political prominence touched the Craft household when their only daughter, Ellen, married Dr. William Crum, who became the United States Minister to Liberia. Boom! That is the story of Ellen Craft and how her husband disguised her as a gentleman so they can escape from slavery, escape from America, then come back, buy a plantation. Boom! They did that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this story. As you know, I'll be back Monday through Friday, 11:15 with another one. I am teaching online. You can sign up on my website, MissJerryWorldwide.com. Click on online learning. I'm also teaching with iUrban Teen, a super dope company out of Seattle. I'm going to be teaching entrepreneurship and through literature, and it's going to be awesome. So make sure you're washing your hands. Thank you. Make sure you're washing your hands. Make sure you're talking and communicating with people. You know, make sure you're making the best of this time. And yep, if y'all need me, you know where to find me. Have a wonderful day.